A note to the reader. I went to India to help myself visualize a people whose cultural history I had been studying for the story of civilization. I did not expect to be attracted by the Hindus or that I should be swept into a passionate interest in Indian politics. I merely hoped to add a little to my material, to look with my own eyes upon certain works of art, and then to return to my historical studies, forgetting this contemporary world. But I saw such things in India as made me feel that study and writing were frivolous things in the presence of a people 1/5 of the human race, suffering poverty and oppression bitterer than any to be found elsewhere on the earth. I was horrified. I had not thought it possible that any government could allow its subjects to sink to such misery. I came away resolved to study living India as well as the India with a brilliant past, to learn more of this unique revolution that fought with suffering accepted but never returned, to read the Gandhi of today as well as the Buddha of long ago. And the more I read, the more I was filled with astonishment and indignation at the apparently conscious and deliberate bleeding of India by England throughout 150 years. I began to feel that I had come upon the greatest crime in all history. And so I asked the reader's permission to abandon for a while my researches into the past, so that I may stand up and say my word for India. I know how weak words are in the face of guns and blood, how irrelevant mere truth and decency appear beside the might of empires and gold. But even if one Hindu fighting for freedom far off there on the other side of the globe shall hear this call of mine and be a trifle comforted, then these months of work on this little book will seem sweet to me. For I know of nothing in the world that I would rather do today than to be of help to India. Will Durant, October 1st, 1930. This book has been written without the knowledge or cooperation in any form of any Hindu or of any person acting for India. I wish to speak in this chapter with unaccustomed partiality and passion. I am poorly qualified to write of India. I have merely crossed it twice between east and west, and once from north to south, and seen hardly a dozen of its cities. And though I have prepared myself with the careful study of 100 volumes, this had all the more convinced me that my knowledge is trifling and fragmentary in the face of civilization 5,000 years old, endlessly rich in philosophy, literature, religion, and art, and infinitely appealing in its ruined grandeur and its weaponless struggle for liberty. If I write at all, it is not only because I feel deeply about India, but because life cannot wait till knowledge is complete. One must speak out and take sides before the fight is over. I have seen a great people starving to death before my eyes, and am convinced that this exhaustion and starvation are due not, as their beneficiaries claim, to overpopulation and superstition, but to the most sordid and criminal exploitation of one nation by another in all recorded history. I propose to show that England has year by year been bleeding India to the point of death, and that self-government of India by the Hindus could not, within any reasonable probability, have worse results than the present form of alien domination. I shall limit myself in this chapter to presenting the case for India, knowing that the case against her has been stated all too well in what may be long remembered as the unfairest book ever written. Nevertheless, lest I should merely repeat and reverse the crime, I shall in a later chapter outline the case for England in India as strongly as I can. In the London Daily Herald of October 17, 1927, Ramsay MacDonald, now Prime Minister of England, declared that further so-called tutelage of India for self-rule was useless. She should have self-government at once, He affirmed that India was already fit for self government and that the only training she required was that of her own experiences in liberty. Shortly before its recent coming to power, the Labour Party of Great Britain officially declared, quote unquote, "We believe that the time has come when our brothers in all parts of India are capable, not will be some time, but are now of controlling their own affairs equally along with South Africa and other British dominions. And we hereby pledge ourselves to assist in every way possible to bring about this much desired reform." I have the honor to agree with the British government. I argue only for Home Rule. I speak not as an American only, but as a member of the family of the English speaking peoples. I rest my case above all on the evidence of Englishmen. I write, I think, in harmony with the fine traditions of English liberalism from Burke and Sheridan and Fox to Burton Russell, Ramsay MacDonald and Bernard Shaw. I like and honor Englishmen, but I am not fond of the British. The English are the best gentlemen on earth. The British are the worst of all imperialists. The English gave the world liberty, and the British are destroying it. I confess that I am prejudiced in favor of liberty. Part 2. A Perspective of India. Let us remember first that India is not a little island, nor a continent sparsely inhabited by savages, but a vast territory containing 320 million souls, 3 times as many as in the United States, more than in North and South America combined, more than in all Europe, west of Russia combined. All in all, 1/5 of the world's population. Let us remember further that in the northern and more important half of India, the people are predominantly of the same race as the Greeks, the Romans, and ourselves, that is, Indo Europeans or Aryans. That though their skin has been browned by the tireless sun, their features resemble ours and are in general more regular and refined than those of the average European. That India was the motherland of our race, and Sanskrit the mother of Europe's languages, and she was the mother of our philosophy, mother through the Arabs of much of our mathematics, mother through Buddha of the ideals embodied in Christianity, mother through the village community of self government and democracy. Mother India is in many ways the mother of us all. Let us remember also, in order that we may see the problem in perspective, the age and variety of India's civilization. Recent excavations at Mohenjo-daro have revealed a civilization 3500 BC with great cities and industries, comfortable homes, and luxuries ranging from bathrooms to statuary and jewelry, all betokening a social condition superior to that prevailing in contemporary Babylonia and Egypt. When Alexander the Great invaded India in 326 BC, his historian Megasthenes recorded his amazement at finding on the Indus a people quite as civilized and artistic as the Greeks, who were then in the height of their curve. At no time in history has India been without civilization. From the days of Buddha in the 5th century, who is to the east what Christ is to the west, through the time when Ashoka, the most humane of emperors, preached the gentle creed of Buddha from pillars and monuments everywhere, down to the 16th century when culture, wealth, and art flourished at Vijayanagar in the south, and a still higher culture and still greater wealth and art flourished under Akbar in the north. It was to reach this India of fabulous riches that Columbus sailed the seas. The civilization that was destroyed by British guns had lasted for 15 centuries, producing saints from Buddha to Ramakrishna and Gandhi, philosophy from the Vedas to Schopenhauer and Bergson, Thoreau and Kieserling, who take their lead and acknowledge their derivation from India. India, says Kieserling, quote unquote, has produced the profoundest metaphysics that we know of. And he speaks of the absolute superiority of India over the West in philosophy. Poetry from Mahabharata, containing the Bhagavad Gita, quote unquote, perhaps the most beautiful work of the literature of the world, down to Sarojini Naidu, greatest of living women poets, and Rabindranath Tagore, who, writing a local dialect in a subject land, has made himself the most famous poet of our time. And how shall we rank a civilization that created the unique and gigantic temples of Ellora, Madura, and Angkor, and the perfect artistry of Delhi, Agra, and Taj Mahal, that indescribable lyric in stone? This evidently was not a minor civilization produced by an inferior people. It ranks with the highest civilizations of history, and some, like Kieseling, would place it at the head and summit of all. When in 1803 the invading British besieged the fort at Agra and their cannon struck near the beautiful Khas Mahal or Hall of Private Audience, the Hindu surrendered at once, lest one of the most perfect creation of the human hand should be ruined like Reims. Who then were the civilized? The British conquest of India was the invasion and destruction of a high civilization by a trading company, utterly without scruple or principle, careless of art and greedy of gain, overrunning with fire and sword a country temporarily disordered and helpless, bribing and murdering, annexing and stealing, and beginning that career of illegal and legal plunder which has now gone on ruthlessly for 173 years and goes on at this moment while in our secure comfort we write and read. Part 3. The Rape of a Continent. When the British came, India was politically weak and economically prosperous. The Mughal dynasty, which had so stimulated art, science, and literature in India, came to the usual fate of monarchies in 1658 when Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, was succeeded by his fanatical son Aurangzeb. For almost 50 years, this Puritanic emperor misgoverned India. When he died, his realm fell to pieces, and petty princes set up their rule in numberless divided and sovereign states. It was a simple matter for a group of English buccaneers, armed with the latest European artillery and morals, to defeat the bows and arrows, the elephants and primitive musketry of the Rajas, and bring one Hindu province after another under the control of the British East India Company. Those who have seen the unspeakable poverty and psychological weakness of the Hindus today will hardly believe that it was the wealth of 18th century India which attracted the commercial pirates of England and France. This wealth, says Sunderland, was created by the Hindus' vast and varied industries. Nearly every kind of manufacture or product known to the civilized world, nearly every kind of creation of man's brain and hand, existing anywhere and prized either for its utility or beauty, had long been produced in India. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or than any other in Asia. Her textile goods, the fine products of her looms in cotton, wool, linen, and silk, were famous over the civilized world. So were her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones cut in every lovely form. So were her pottery, porcelains, ceramics of every kind, quality, color, and beautiful shape. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great engineering works. She had great merchants, great businessmen, great bankers and financiers. Not only was she the greatest shipbuilding nation, but she had great commerce and trade by land and sea, which extended to all known civilized countries. Such was the India which was the British found when they came. It was this wealth that the East India Company proposed to appropriate, Already in 1686, its directors declared their intention to establish a large, well grounded, sure English dominion in India for all time to come. The company rented from the Hindu authorities trading posts at Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay and fortified them without permission of the authorities with troops and cannon. In 1756, the Rajah of Bengal, resenting the invasion, attacked the English fort William, captured it, and crowded 146 English prisoners into the Black Hole of Calcutta, from which only 23 emerged alive the next morning. A year later, Robert Clive defeated the Bengal forces at Plassey with a loss of only 22 British killed, and thereupon declared his company the owner of the richest province in India. He added further territory by forging and violating treaties, by playing one native prince against another, and by generous bribes given and received. $4 million were sent out the river to Calcutta in one shipment. He accepted presents amounting to $1.17 million from Hindu rulers dependent upon his favor and his guns, pocketed from them in addition an annual tribute of $140,000, took to opium, was investigated and exonerated by Parliament, and killed himself. When I think, he said, of the marvelous riches of that country and the comparatively small part which I took away, I am astonished at my own moderation. Such were the morals of the men who proposed to bring civilization to India. His successors in the management of the company now began a century of unmitigated rape on the resources of India. They profiteered without hindrance. Goods which they sold in England for $10 million they bought for $2 million in India. They engaged corporately and individually in inland, and by refusing to pay the tolls exacted of Hindu traders acquired a lucrative monopoly. The company paid such fabulous dividends that its stock rose to $32,000 a share. Its agents deposed and set up Hindu rulers according to bribes refused or received. In 10 years, they took in, through such presents, $30 million. They forged documents as circumstances required and hanged Hindus for forging documents. Clive had set up Mir Zafar as ruler of Bengal for $6,192,875. Clive's successors deposed him and set up Mir Qasim on the payment of $1,001,345. 3 years later, they restored Mir Zafar for $2,500,825. 2 years later, they replaced him with Nazim ud Dawla, $1,151,780. They taxed the provinces under the company so exorbitantly that two-thirds of the population fled. Defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. It was usual to demand 50% of the net produce of the land. Every effort, lawful and unlawful, says a Bombay administration report written by Englishmen, was made to get the utmost out of the wretched peasantry who were subjected to torture, in some instances cruel and revolting beyond all description, if they would not or could not yield what was demanded. Warren Hastings exacted contributions as high as $250,000 from native princes to the treasury of the company. He accepted bribes to exact no more, exacted more, and annexed the estates that could not pay. He allowed his agents to use torture in extorting contributions. He helped the Nawabs of Awadh to rob his mother and grandmother in order to pay the company $5 million. He occupied the province of Awadh with his army, captured it, and then sold it to a prince for $2,500,000. He lent a British army to a Hindu Raja for $2 million and made no complaint when it was used to slaughter and be slaughtered for savage purposes. Everybody and everything, says the Oxford History of India, was on sale. And Macaulay writes, during the 5 years which followed the departure of Clive from Bengal, the misgovernment of the English was carried to such a point as seemed incompatible and the existence of society. The servants of the company forced the natives to buy dear and to sell cheap. Enormous fortunes were thus rapidly accumulated at Calcutta, while 30 millions of human beings were reduced to the extremity of wretchedness. They had been accustomed to live under tyranny, and never under tyranny like this. Under their old masters, they had at least one resource. When the evil became insupportable, the people rose and pulled down the government. But the English government was not to be shaken off. That government, oppressive as the most oppressive form of barbarian despotism, was strong with all the strength of civilization. By 1858, the crimes of the company so smelled to heaven that the British government took over the captured and plundered territories as a colony of the crown. A little island took over half a continent. England paid the company handsomely and added the purchase price to the public debt of India to be redeemed, principal and interest, originally at 10.5%, out of the taxes put upon the Hindu people. All the debts on the company's books, together with the accrued interest on these debts, were added to the public obligations of India to be redeemed out of the taxes put upon the Hindu people. Exploitation was dressed now in all the forms of law, that is, the rules laid down by the victors of the vanquished. Hypocrisy was added to brutality, while the robbery went on. The British conquest brought certain advantages to India. In 1829, Lord William Bentinck decreed the abolition of sati, the immolation of widows with their dead husbands, and acknowledged handsomely the aid given him by native reform organizations. The Portuguese had abolished the customs in their Indian possessions 390 years before. Men like Bentinck, Munro, Elphinstone, and Macaulay carried into the administration of India something of the generous liberalism which for a time controlled England in 1832. The English put an end to the thugs, an organized caste of robbers, and completed the abolition of slavery. They built railways for commercial and military purposes, introduced factories, and promoted the growth of population. They established a small number of schools, brought the science and technology to the West, to India, gave to the East the democratic ideals of modern Europe, and played an important part, through their scholars, in revealing to the world the cultural wealth of India's past. The price of these benefactions was considerable. It included, to begin with, the expropriation of state after state from the native rulers by war or bribery, or the simple decree of Lord Dalhousie that whenever a Hindu prince died without leaving a direct heir, his territory should pass to the British. In Dalhousie's administration alone, 8 states were absorbed in this peaceful way. Province after province was taken over by offering its ruler a choice between a pension and war. In the seventh decade of the 19th century, England added 4,000 square miles to her Indian territory. In the eighth decade, 15,000 square miles. In the ninth, 90,000. In the 10th, 133,000. John Morley estimated that during the 19th century alone, England carried on 111 wars in India, using for the most part Indian troops. Millions of Hindus shed their blood that India might be slave. The cost of these wars for the conquest of India was met to the last penny out of Indian taxes. The English congratulated themselves on conquering India without spending a cent. Certainly, it was a remarkable, if not a magnanimous achievement to steal in 40 years 250,000 square miles and make the victims pay every penny of the expense. When at last in 1857 the exhausted Hindus resisted, they were suppressed with medieval ferocity. A favorite way of dealing with captured rebels was to blow them to bits from the mouths of cannon. We took said the London Spectator. At least 100,000 Indian lives in the mutiny. This is what the English call the Sepoy Mutiny and what the Hindus call the War of Independence. There is much in a name. Let Englishmen describe the result. A report to the House of Commons by one of its investigating committee in 1804 stated, quote unquote, "It must give pain to an Englishman to think that since the accession of the company, the condition of the people of India has been worse than before." In 1826, the English Bishop Heber wrote, quote unquote, "The peasantry in the company's provinces are, on the whole, worse off, poorer, and more dispirited than the subjects of native princes. I met with very few men who will not, in confidence, own their belief that the people are overtaxed, and that the country is in a gradual state of impoverishment." James Mill, historian of India, wrote, quote unquote, "Under their dependence upon the British government, the people of Awadh and Karnataka, two of the noblest provinces of India, were, by misgovernment, plunged into a state of wretchedness with which hardly any part of the earth has anything to compare. I consciously believe," said Lieutenant Colonel Briggs in 1830, quote unquote, "that under no government whatever, Hindu or Mohammedan, professing to be actuated by law, was any system so suppressive of the prosperity of the people at large as that which has marked our administration." F. J. Shore, British administration in Bengal, testified as follows to the House of Commons in 1857. "The fundamental principle of the English has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient in every possible way to the interests and benefits of themselves. They have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every successive province, as it has fallen into our possession, has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort. The Indians have been excluded from every honor, dignity, or office which the lowest Englishman could be prevailed upon to accept." Such was the method of British acquisition of India. This is the origin of the Britain claimed to rule India today. And now, leaving the past, we shall examine the present and show point after point how English rule is at this very moment, with all its modest improvements, destroying Hindu civilization and the Hindu people. Part 4. The Caste System in India. The present caste system in India consists of 4 classes: the real Brahmins, that is, the British bureaucracy; the real Kshatriyas, that is, the British army; the real Vaishyas, that is, the British traders; and the real Shudras and untouchables, that is, the Hindu people. Consider first the bureaucracy. Here, even the irate lover of liberty will concede some measures of decency and progress since the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919. 1/4 of India's population still remains under native princes who are free, with their councils, to govern their states in any manner satisfactory to the British resident appointed to safeguard the interests of the empire. Some of these native states, Mysore and Baroda in particular, have admirable constitutions and are advancing more rapidly in education and freedom than the British provinces of India. Each of the latter has a legislature. 70% of the members are elected by a property limited franchise. 25 to 30% are officials or nominees of the British government. Above each legislature is a double ministry or diarchy, an executive council appointed by and responsible only to the British authorities, administering law and order and the taxation of the land, and a ministerial council chosen by the provincial governor from the leaders of the legislature, responsible to the legislature and managing transferred and harmless subjects like education, excise, health, etc. At the head of each province is a governor appointed by the British Crown, responsible not to the legislature but to the Viceroy and the British Parliament, empowered to nullify any law passed by the legislature or to pass any law or tax refused by the legislature whenever it may seem to him desirable. The central legislature meeting at Delhi has a lower house or assembly of 144 members, 31 of them appointed by the government, 104 elected by a franchise so restricted by property qualifications that only one person out of the 250 is allowed to vote. The upper house or council of state has 60 members, 27 appointed by the government, 33 elected by a still more restricted franchise. The voters vote not as citizens of India, but as members of a given social or religious group. The Hindus are permitted to elect a specified number of Hindus, the Muslims a number of Muslims, the European a number of Europeans. The allotment of representatives is out of all proportion to population. This, if we may believe the British, was required to meet the fears of the Muslim minority, whose number, some 22% of the population, in effect, however, intensifies and encourages the racial and religious divisions which statesmanship would seek to heal. Above this central legislature, and acknowledging no responsibility to it, stand the Viceroy and his Executive Council, appointed by the Crown. The Viceroy has repeatedly used the power to veto, even over a unanimous vote of the legislature, any bill which he considers detrimental to British interests. He has often used the power to enact laws rejected by the legislature and to collect taxes or make expenditures refused by it. The Simon Report recommends the continuance of these powers. On many subjects, the legislature is not permitted to vote. On some, it is not permitted to speak. Expenditures on defense and in the political and ecclesiastical departments, and certain salaries and pensions need not be voted. Subject to the British Parliament, the Viceroy is omnipotent. He is not omniscient. He is a political appointee, chosen for his executive ability as manager of a concern demanding high dividends out of poor rolling stock. He is seldom selected for his knowledge of India. Sympathy with it would disqualify him as a disqualified Lord Ripon. After 5 years of service, the Viceroy acquires some knowledge of the people and the country and is replaced. With a government responsible to England, not to India, it is natural that the power of taxation should be freely used. Though before the coming of the English, the land was private property, the government made itself the sole owner of the soil and charged for it a land tax or rental now equal to 1/5 of the produce. In many cases in the past, this land tax has amounted to half the gross produce, in some cases to more than the entire gross produce. In general, it is 2 to 3 times as high as under pre-English rule. The government has the exclusive right to manufacture salt and adds to its sale price a tax amounting to 1/2 cent per pound. When we remember that the average annual income in India is only $33 and recall the judgment of a missionary paper, The Indian Witness, that, quote unquote, it is safe to assume that 100 million of the population of India have an annual income of not more than $5 a head. We begin to understand how oppressive even these taxes may be, and how much they share in responsibility for the ill health and emancipation of the Hindus. A member of parliament, Cathcart Wilson, says, quote unquote, the percentage of taxes in India as related to the gross produce is more than that of any other country. Until recently, the rate was twice as high as in England, 3 times as high as in Scotland. Herbert Spencer protested against the pitiless taxation which wrings from the poor Indian ryots nearly half the product of their soil. Another Englishman, the late H. M. Hindeman, after detailing the proof that taxation in India was far heavier than any other country, though its population is poorer, entitled his book The Bankruptcy of India. Sir William Hunter, former member of Viceroy Council, said in 1875, quote unquote, "The government assessment does not leave enough food to the cultivator to support himself and his family throughout the year." Mr. Thorburn, one-time financial commissioner of Punjab, said that the whole revenue of Punjab is practically drawn from the producing masses. Since the enactment of the income tax, this is no longer true. I asked the guide at Trichunapalli how the people of India had found 300 or 400 years ago the money to build the vast temples there and at Madura and Tanjore. He answered that the Raja had been able to build these edifices despite the fact that they had taxed the people much less severely than the English were doing. Against this terrible bloodletting, the Hindus have no redress. Their legislatures are impotent. And in the midst of the heartbreaking poverty engendered partly by this taxation, the government treats itself at staggering cost to gigantic office buildings at Delhi, needlessly alien in style to the architecture of India. For 7 months of every year, it transfers the capital, with all its machinery and personnel, to vacation resorts in the mountains at an expense of millions of dollars, and from time to time it holds gorgeous darbars to impress the people who provide tens of millions for the ceremony. It pays to be free. The result is that the national debt of India, which was $35 million in 1792, rose to $105 million in 1805, to $150 million in 1829, to $215 million in 1845, to $275 million in 1850, to $350 million in 1858, to $500 million in 1860, to $1,000 million in 1901, to $1,535 million in 1913, and to $3,500 million in 1929. Let these figures tell the tale. The second caste in India is the British Army. The Indian forces number some 204,000 men. 60,000 of them are British, including all officers. 1,874 are aviators, the last resort of despotism. There are only a few Hindu officers, and no Hindu is allowed in the Air Force or the artillery. But 70% of the common soldiery are natives. The Hindus are reputed by British to be incapable of self-defense, but no British government has been willing to believe this to the extent of allowing Hindus to learn the art of incorporated murder. The expense of maintaining this army, whose function is the continual subjection of India by bullets, shells, and air bombs, is borne by the Indian people. In 1926, its cost was $200,735,660, a tax of 3% on the scanty earnings of every man, woman, and child in the land. Wherever the Indian army sheds its mostly native blood, in Afghanistan or Burma or Mesopotamia or France, for the government is free to send it anywhere, the expense is met not by the empire which it enlarges or defends, but by Indian revenues alone. When England had to send British troops to India in 1857, it charged India with the cost not only of transporting them, maintaining them in India, and bringing them back home, but with their maintenance in Great Britain for 6 months before they sailed. During the 19th century, India paid $450 million for wars fought for England outside of India with Indian troops. She contributed $500 million to the war chest of the Allies, $700 million in subscriptions to war loans, 800,000 soldiers, and 400,000 laborers to defend the British Empire outside of India during the Great War. In 1922, 64% of total revenue of India was devoted to this army of fratricides. Hindu compelled to kill Hindus in Burma until Burma consented to come under British rule. Hindus compelled to defend on the fields of Flanders the empire, which in every year, as will appear later, was starving 10 million Hindus to death. No other army in the world consumes so large a proportion of the public revenues. In 1926, the Viceroy announced the intention of the government to build a Royal Indian Navy. The proposal added that this navy should be used wherever in the empire the British Parliament might care to send it, and that the entire cost of the navy should be met from the revenues of India. It pays to be free. Under these British castes toiled the real pariahs or untouchables of India, the Hindu people. In 1833, the British Parliament decreed that no native of our Indian Empire shall, by reason of his colour, his descent, or his religion, be incapable of holding office. In 1858, Queen Victoria, in an official proclamation, announced it as her will that, so far as may be, our subjects of whatever race or creed be freely and impartially admitted to offices in our service, the duties of which they may be qualified by their education, ability, and integrity duly to discharge. Nevertheless, the actual policy of the British in India has been one of the political exclusion and social scorn. Every year, the Indian college graduates 12,000 students. Every year, hundreds of Hindu graduate from universities in Europe or America and return to their native land. But only the lowest places in the civil service are open to them. Not more than 4% of positions bringing over $4,000 per year are held by Hindus. These berths are reserved for the British. Some of the invaders are capable executives, well worth their high salaries, but most of them are poorly rated by their countrymen. Lord Asquith declared in 1909 that if high places were given to Hindus half as unfit as the Englishmen who then occupied them in India would be regarded as a public scandal. Sir Louis Mallet, formerly Under Secretary of State for India, and Ramsay MacDonald, who studied India at first hand, expressed similar opinions. Dr. V. A. Rutherford, MP, says, quote, unquote, for every post held in India by Englishmen, it would be quite safe to say that there are 5 or 10 Indians well qualified to discharge its duties and at less than half the cost. Englishmen must be doubly paid to bear the heat of India. Liberals like Elphinstone and Munro, Bentinck and Macaulay, Wingate and Ripon protested in vain against this refusal of function to the educated intelligence of India. This decapitation of an entire people, as Lajpat Rai called it. It is the commonest thing, says an American missionary, to see Indian scholars and officials of confessedly high ability, of very fine training, and of long experience serving under young Englishmen who in England would not be thought fit to fill a government or a business position above the second or even third class. Eminent Hindu physicians and surgeons, says Ramanandra Chatterjee, are compelled to spend the best years of their lives in subordinate positions as assistant surgeons, while raw and callow youths lord it over them and draw 4 to 5 times their pay. Sir Thomas Munro, British Governor of Madras, said almost a century ago, under the sway of every Mohammedan conqueror of natives of India have been admitted to all the highest dignities of the state. It is only under the British government that they have been excluded from this advantage and held in a condition, even when employed in a public department, little superior to that of menial servants. Since I am writing confidentially, said Lord Lytton, Viceroy of India in 1878, I do not hesitate to say that both the government of England and of India appear to me, up to the present moment, unable to answer satisfactorily the charge of having taken every means in their power of breaking to the heart the words of promise they have uttered to the ear. The final element in the real caste system of India is the social treatment of the Hindus by the British. The latter may be genial Englishmen when they arrive, gentlemen famous as lovers of fair play, but they are soon turned by the example of their leaders and the poison of irresponsible power into the most arrogant and overbearing bureaucracy on earth. Nothing can be more striking, said a report to Parliament in 1830, than the scorn with which the people have been practically treated at the hands of even those who were actuated by most benevolent motives. The English in India act as if they felt, as doubtless they do, that their superior position can be best maintained by asserting it at every step, by avoiding participation in the life of the people, by setting up against them every aristocratic social distinction, by treating them in every way as an inferior race. Cohn described this arrogance as known to no other colonizing nation. Sunderland reports that the British treat the Hindus as strangers and foreigners in India in a manner quite as unsympathetic, harsh, and abusive as was ever seen among the Georgia and Louisiana planters in the old days of American slavery. And he tells of several cases in which British soldiers forcibly ejected from railway compartments educated Brahmins and courtly Rajas who had tickets for their space. Sable Zimand corroborates him. Many of the distinctions drawn against Indians are like those made against the Negroes in our South, minus lynching. I could fill a volume with such instances. Sir Henry Cotton, long a high British official in India, declares that the government there is as complete a bureaucracy as Russia's under the Tsar, that it is an autocratic in its methods, as reactionary in its spirit, as determined as ever the Russian aristocracy was to keep all power and advantage in its hands. I must add that I did not myself observe any important instances of this snobbishness, except in the forgivable exclusion of the Hindus from English clubs. My critics will remind me of the narrowness and brevity of my experience. The result is a pitiful crushing of the Hindu spirit, a stifling of its pride and growth, a stunting of genius that once flourished in every city of the land. Have you felt that the Hindu character is degraded, that it lacks virility and initiative? But what people could have retained these qualities under such ruthless alien rule? Subjection to a foreign yoke, says Professor Ross, is one of the most potent causes of the decay of nations, said Charles Francis Adams before the American Historical Association in 1901. There is not an instance in all recorded history where a so-called inferior race or community has been elevated in its character or made self-sustaining or self-governing or even put on the way to that result through a condition of dependency or tutelage. I might, without much danger, assert that the condition of dependency, even for communities of the same race and blood, always exercises as emasculating and deteriorating influence. I would undertake, if called upon, to show that this rule is invariable. The foreign system under which India is governed today, says Gandhi, has reduced India to pauperism and emasculation. We have lost self-confidence. The British charge the Hindu with lack of manliness, but it is the British who have driven it out of him by the accident of superior guns and the policy of merciless rule. If there is rebellion in India today, let every true Briton be glad, for it means that India is not quite dead, that the spirit of liberty is risen again, and the Hindu can be a man after all. Number 5. Economic destruction. The economic condition of India is the inevitably corollary of its political exploitation. Even the casual traveler perceives the decay of agriculture, which absorbs 85% of the people, and the destitution of the peasant. He sees the Hindu riot in the rice fields, wading almost naked in the mud of a foreign tyrant's land. His loin cloth is all the finery that he has. In 1915, the Statistical Department of Bengal, the most prosperous of India's provinces, calculated the average wage of the able bodied agricultural laborer to be $3.60 per month. His hut is of branches often open at the sides and loosely roofed with straw, or it is a square of dried mud adorned with a cot of dried mud and covered with mud and sticks and leaves. The entire house and furnishings of a family of six, including all their clothing, are worth $10. The peasant cannot afford newspapers or books, entertainment, tobacco, or drink. Almost half his earning goes to the government. And if he cannot pay the tax, his holding, which may have been in the family for centuries, is confiscated by the state. If he is fortunate, he escapes from the overtaxed land and takes refuge in the cities, provided there are not too many other applicants. He may get work in Delhi, the capital of India, carrying away the white master's excrement. Sanitary facilities are unnecessary when slaves are cheap. Or he can go to the factory and become, if he is very lucky, one of the 1,409,000 hands of India. He will find difficulty in getting a place, for 33% of factory workers are women and 8% are children. In the mines, 34% of the employees are women, of whom one half work underground. 16% of the miners are children. In the cotton mills of Bombay, the heat is exhausting, and the lungs are soon destroyed by the fluff-laden air. Men work there until they reach a subsistence wage, and then their health breaks down. More than half the factories use their employees 54 hours a week. The average wage of the factory worker is 60 to 70 cents a day, though allowance must be made for the inferior skills and strength of the Hindus as compared with the European or American laborer long trained in the ways of machine. In Bombay in 1922, despite the factory acts of the year, the average wage of cotton worker was 33 cents. In that same year, the profit of the owners of those mills was 125%. This was an off year. In better years, the owner said the profits were 200%. The workman's home is like his wage. Usually it consists of one room, shared by the family with various animals. Zarmond found one room with 30 tenants. Such is the industrial revolution that a British government has allowed to develop under its control, despite the example of enlightened legislation in America and England. The people flock to the factories because the land cannot support them, and the land cannot support them because it is overtaxed, because it is overpopulated, and because the domestic industries with which the peasants formerly eked out in winter their gleanings from the summer fields have been destroyed by British control of Indian tariffs and trade. For of old the handicrafts of India were known throughout the world. It was manufactured, that is, handmade goods which European merchants bought from India to sell to the West. In 1680, says the British historian Orme, the manufacture of cotton was almost universal in India. And the busy spinning wheels enabled the women to round out the earnings of their men. But the English and India objected to this competition of domestic industry with their mills at home. They resolved that India should be reduced to a purely agricultural country and be forced in consequence to become a vast market for British machine-made goods. The directors of the East India Company gave orders that the production of raw silk should be encouraged and the manufacture of silk fabrics discouraged. That silk winders should be compelled to work in the company's factories and be prohibited, under severe penalties, from working outside. Parliament discussed ways and means of replacing Hindu by British industries. A tariff of 70 to 80% was placed upon Hindu textile imported into free trade England, while India was compelled by foreign control of her government to admit English textiles almost duty-free. Lest Indian industries should nevertheless continue somehow to exist, an excise tax was placed on the manufacture of cotton goods in India. As a British historian puts it, It is a melancholy instance of the wrong done to India by the country on which she has become dependent. Had India been independent, she would have retaliated, would have imposed prohibitive duties upon British goods, and would thus have preserved her own productive industry from annihilation. This act of self defense was not permitted her. She was at the mercy of the stranger. British goods were forced upon her without paying any duty, and the foreign manufacturer employed the arm of political injustice to keep down and ultimately strangle a competitor with whom he could not have been contended on equal terms. And another Englishman wrote, "We have done everything possible to impoverish still further the miserable beings subject to the cruel selfishness of English commerce. Under the pretense of free trade, England has compelled the Hindus to receive the products of the steam looms of Lancashire, Yorkshire, Glasgow, etc., at merely nominal duties, while the hand-wrought manufacturers of Bengal and Bihar, beautiful in fabrics and durable in wear, have heavy and almost prohibitive duties imposed on their importation into England. The result was that Manchester and Paisley flourished and Indian industries declined. A country well on the way to prosperity was forcibly arrested in its development and compelled to be only a rural hinterland for industrial England. The mineral wealth abounding in India's soil was not explored, for no competition with England was to be allowed. The millions of skilled artisans whom Indian handicrafts had maintained were added to the hundreds of millions who sought support from the land. India, says Cohn, was transformed into a purely agricultural country, and her people lived perpetually on the verge of starvation. The vast population, which might have been comfortably supported by a combination of tillage and industry, became too great for the arid soil, and India was reduced to such penury that today nothing is left of her men, her women, and her children but empty stomachs and fleshless bones. It might have been supposed that the building of 30,000 miles of railways would have brought a measure of prosperity in India. But these railways were built not for India but for England, not for the benefit of the Hindu, but for the purposes of the British Army and British trade. If this seems doubtful, observe their operation. Their greatest revenue comes not, as in America, from the transport of goods, for the British trader controls the rates, but from the third-class passengers, the Hindus. But these passengers are herded into almost barren coaches like animals bound for the slaughter, 20 or more in one compartment. The railroads are entirely in European hands, and the government has refused to appoint even one Hindu to the railway board. The railways lose money year after year and are helped by the government out of the revenues of the people. These loans to date total over $100 million. The government guarantees a minimum rate of interest on railway investments. The British companies who built the roads ran no risk whatever. No play or encouragement is given to initiative, competition, or private enterprise. The worst evils of a state monopoly are in force. All the losses are borne by the people. All the gains are gathered by the trader. So much for the railways. Commerce on the sea is monopolized by British even more than transport on land. The Hindus are not permitted to organize a merchant marine of their own. All Indian goods must be carried in British bottoms as an additional strain on the starving nation's purse, and the buildings of ships, which once gave employment to thousands of Hindus, is prohibited. To this ruining of the land with taxation, this ruining of industry with tariffs, and this ruining of commerce with foreign control, add the drainage of millions upon millions of dollars from India year after year, and the attempt to explain India's poverty as a result of her superstitions becomes a dastardly deception practiced upon a world too busy to be well informed. This drain having been denied, it is only necessary to state the facts and to introduce them with a quotation from a document privately addressed by the British government in India to the Parliament of England. Great Britain, in addition to the tribute which she makes India pay her through the customs, derives benefits from the savings of the service of the three presidencies, the provinces of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, being spent in England instead of in India. And in addition to these savings, which probably amount to $500 million, she derives benefit from the fortunes realized by the European mercantile community, which are all remitted to England. This is a general statement. Let us fill it in. Consider first the drain on India through trade. Not merely is this carried in British ships, far worse than that. There is an astounding surplus of exports over imports. In the happy years of the company, there were such balances as $30 million exports and $3 million imports. Latterly, the indecency has been reduced, and the excess of goods taken from India over goods brought into India is now a moderate one-third. In 1927, for example, imports were $651,600,000. Exports were $892,800,000. The excess of exports, $241,200,000. Where goes the money that pays for this excess? We are asked to believe that it takes the form of silver or gold imported and hoarded by Hindus. But no man that has seen their poverty can believe so shameless a myth. Doubtless there is some hoarding, above all by the native princes, for India cannot be expected to put full faith in a banking system controlled by foreign masters. But it is the officials, the merchants and the manufacturers, most of whom are British, who take the great bulk of this profit and return it to their countries in one form or another. As an East Indian merchant said in a parliamentary report in 1853, when this process of bleeding was on a comparatively modest scale, generally up to 1847 the imports were about $30 million and the exports about $47,500,000. The difference is the tribute which the company received from the country. Consider second the drain through fortunes, dividends and profits made in India and spent abroad. The British come as officials or soldiers or traders. They make their money and return to Great Britain. Let an Englishman, Edmund Burke, describe them and intensifies his description today in proportion to the growth of British positions, manufacturers and commerce in India. They have no more social habits with the people than if they still reside in England, nor indeed any species of intercourse but that which is necessary to make a sudden fortune. Animated with all the avarice of age and all the impetuosity of youth, they roll one after another, wave after wave, and there is nothing before the eyes of natives but an endless, hopeless prospect of new flights of birds of prey and passage, with appetites continually renewing for a food that is continually wasting. Every rupee of profit made by an Englishman is lost forever to India. Consider third, the drain through salaries and pensions derived from India and spent abroad. In 1927, Lord Winterton showed in the House of Commons that there were then some 7,500 retired officials in Great Britain drawing annually $17,500,000 in pensions from the Indian revenue. Ramsay MacDonald put the figure at $20 million a year. When England, which is almost as overpopulated as Bengal, sends its son to India, she requires of them 24 years of service, reduced by 4 years of furloughs. She then retires them for life on a generous pension paid by the Hindu people. Even during their service, these officials send their families or their children to live for the most part in England, and they support them there with funds derived from India. Almost everything bought by the British in India, except the more perishable food, is purchased from abroad. A great proportion of the funds appropriated for supplies by the Government of India is spent in England. As early as 1783, Edmund Burke predicted that the annual drain of Indian resources to England without equivalent return would eventually destroy India. From Plassey to Waterloo, 57 years, the drain of India's wealth to England is computed by Brooks Adams at $2.5 to $5 billion. He adds, what Macaulay suggested long ago, that it was this stolen wealth from India which supplied England with free capital for the development of mechanical inventions and so made possible the Industrial Revolution. In 1901, Dutt estimated that one half of net revenues of India flowed annually out of the country, never to return. In 1906, Mr. Hindman reckoned the drain at $40 million a year. A.J. Wilson valued it at one-tenth of the total annual production of India. Montgomery Martin, estimating the drain at $15 million a year in 1838, calculated that these annual sums retained and gathering interest in India would amount in half a century to $40 billion. Though it may seem merely spectacular to juggle these figures, it is highly probable that the total wealth drained from India since 1757, if it had all been left and invested in India, would now amount at a low rate of interest to $400 billion. Allow for money reinvested in India, and a sum remains easily equivalent to the difference between the poorest and the richest nations in the world. The same high rate of taxation which has bled India to perhaps a mortal weakness might have done her no permanent injury if the wealth so taken had all been returned into the economy and circulation of the country. But bodily withdrawn from her as so much of it was, it has acted like a long continued transfusion of vital blood. So great an economic drain out of the resources of the land, says Dutt, would impoverish the most prosperous countries on earth. It has reduced India to a land of famines more frequent, more widespread, and more fatal than any known before in the history of India or of the world. Sir Wilfrid Scowen Blunt sums it up from the point of view of a true Englishman. India's famines have been severer and more frequent. Its agricultural poverty has deepened. Its rural population has become more hopelessly in debt, their despair more desperate. The system of constantly enhancing the land values, that is, raising the valuation and assessment, has not been altered. The salt tax still robs the very poor. What was bad 25 years ago is worse now. At any rate, there is the same drain of India's food to alien mouths. Endemic famines and endemic plagues are facts no official statistics can explain away. Though myself a good conservative, I own to being shocked at the bondage in which the Indian people are held, and I have come to the conclusion that if we go on developing the country at the present rate, the inhabitants sooner or later will have to resort to cannibalism, for there will be nothing left for them to eat. Part 6. Social Destruction. From such poverty come ignorance, superstition, disease, and death. A people reduced to these traits cannot afford education. They cannot afford the taxes required to maintain adequate schools. They cannot afford to spare their children from productive employment during the years of public instruction. Every penny is taken from them that could have been used for proper education. When the British came, there was throughout India a system of communal schools managed by the village communities. The agents of the East India Company destroyed these village communities and took no steps to replace the schools. Even today, after a century of effort to restore them, they stand at only 66% of their number 100 years ago. There are now in India 730,000 villages and only 162,015 primary schools. Only 7% of the boys and 1.5% of the girls receive schooling, that is, 4% of the whole. Such schools as the government has established are not free, but exact a tuition fee which, though small to a Western purse, looms large to a family always hovering on the edge of starvation. We have been told that the country's schools do not grow more rapidly because women teachers cannot be found for them, and that these teachers refuse to go because they fear that they will be raped. But women are considerably safer in India than in New York, not to speak of the invariably passive mood of the verb seduce. Every student of India knows that the country's school lag behind not for such lurid reasons, but simply because the pay for new teachers is $5 a month, for a trained teacher $5 to $6.50 a month, for principals $7 to $10 a month. Until 1921, the pay for primary school teachers in the Madras Presidency was $24 to $36 a year. Some allowance must be made for the lower cost of commodities in India. The government spends every year on education 8 cents a head. It spends on the army 83 cents a head. In 1911, a Hindu representative, Gokhale, introduced a bill for universal compulsory primary education in India. It was defeated by the British and government-appointed members. In 1916, Patel introduced a similar bill which was defeated by the British and government-appointed members. The government could not afford to give the people schools. Instead, it spent most of its 8 cents for education on secondary schools and universities, where the language used was English. The history, literature, customs, and morals taught were English, and young Hindus, after striving amid poverty to prepare themselves for college, found that they had merely let themselves in for a ruthless process that aimed to denationalize and de-Indianize them, and turn them into imitative Englishmen. The first charge on modern state after the maintenance of public health is the establishment of education, universal, compulsory and free. But the total expenditure for education in India is less than one half the educational expenditure in New York State. In the quarter of a century between 1882 and 1907, while public schools were growing all over the world, the appropriation for education in British India increased by 2 million. In the same period, appropriations for the fratricide army increased by $43 million. It pays to be free. Hence the 93% illiteracy of India. In several provinces, literacy was more widespread before the British took possession than it is now after a century and a half of British control. In several of the states ruled by native princes, it is higher than in British India. The responsibility of the British for India's illiteracy seems to be beyond question. The excuse that caste interferes with education will not hold. Caste did not interfere with the crowding of every Hindu class indiscriminately in railway coaches, tram cars, and factories. It need not have interfered with school. The best way to conquer caste would have been through schools. Is it any wonder that a people too stupefied with poverty and lack of education is too ignorant to use birth control and practice its superstitions worsen even than those of the West? Instead of encouraging education, the government encouraged drink. When the British came, India was a sober nation. The temperance of the people, said Warren Hastings, is demonstrated in the simplicity of their food and their total abstinences from spirituous, liquors, and other substances of intoxication. With the first trading posts established by the British, saloons were opened for the sale of rum, and the East India Company made handsome profits from the trade. When the Crown took over India, it depended on the saloons for a large part of its revenue. The license systems was so arranged as to stimulate drinking and sales. The government revenue from such licenses has increased sevenfold in the last 40 years. In 1922, it stood at $60 million annually, 3 times the appropriation for schools and universities. Miss Mayo tells us that the Hindu mothers feed opium to their children, and she concludes that India is not fit for home rule. What she says is true. What she does not say makes what she says worse than a straightforward lie. She does not tell us though she must have known that women drug their children because the mothers must abandon them every day to go to work in the factories. She does not tell us that opium is grown only by the government and is sold exclusively by the government, that its sale, like the sale of drink through saloons, is carried on despite the protests of the Nationalist Congress, the industrial and social conferences, the provincial conferences, the Brahmo Samaj, the Arya Samaj, the Mohammedans and Christians. And there are 7,000 opium shops in India operated by the British government in the most conspicuous places in every town. That the central legislature in 1921 passed a bill prohibiting the growth or sale of opium in India, and that the government refused to act upon it. That from 2 to 4,000 acres of India's soil, solely needed for the raising of food, are given over to the growing of opium, and that the sale of the drug brings to the government 1/9 of its total revenue every year. She does not tell us that Burma excluded opium by law until the British came and is now overrun with it, that the British distributed it free in Burma to create a demand for it, that whereas the traffic has been stopped in the Philippines, England has refused, at one World Opium Conferences after another, to abandon it in India, that though she has agreed to reduce the export of opium by 10% yearly, she has refused to reduce its sale in India, that the report of the Government Retrenchment Commission in 1925 emphasized the importance of safeguarding opium sales as an important source of revenue and recommended no further reduction, that when Gandhi, by a peaceful anti-opium campaign in Assam, had reduced the consumption of the drug there by 1/2, the government put a stop to his labors and jailed 44 of his aides. She does not tell us that the health, courage, and character of the Hindu people have been undermined through this ruthless drugging of a nation by men pretending to be Christians. On July 10, 1833, Lord Macaulay addressed the House of Commons as follows: "It was the practice of the miserable tyrants whom we found in India, that when they dreaded the capacity and spirit of some distinguished subject, and yet could not venture to murder him, to administer to him a daily dose of the posta, a preparation of opium, the effect of which was in a few months to destroy all the bodily and mental powers of the wretch who was drugged with it, and turn him into a helpless idiot. The detestable artifice, more horrible than assassination itself, was worthy of those who employed it. It is no model for the English nation. We shall never consent to administer the posta to a whole community, to stupefy and paralyze a great people." These words were spoken almost a century ago. Part 7. The Triumph of Death. The last chapter is disease and death. The emaciation of the Hindu sickens the traveler. Closed fingers can be run up around their bare legs from the ankles to the knees. In the cities, 34% of them are absent from work on any day from illness or injury. They are too poor to afford foods rich in mineral salts. They are too poor to buy fresh vegetables, much less to buy meat. The water supply, which is usually the first obligation of a government, is in primitive condition after a century or more of British rule. Dysentery and malaria have been eliminated from Panama and Cuba, but they flourish in British India. Once the Hindu was known to be among the cleanest of the clean, and even today he bathes every morning and washes every morning the simple garment that he wears, but the increase of poverty has made social sanitation impossible. Until 1918, the total expenditure on public health of both the central and the provincial governments combined was only $5 million a year for 240 million people, an appropriation of 2 cents per capita. Sir William Hunter, once Director General of Indian Statistics, estimated that 40 million of the people of India were seldom or never able to satisfy their hunger. Weakened with malnutrition, they offer low resistance to infections. Epidemics periodically destroy millions of them. In 1901, 272,000 died of plague introduced from abroad. In 1902, in 1902, 500,000 died of plague. In 1903, 800,000. In 1904, 1 million. In 1918, there was 125 million cases of influenza and 12,500,000 recorded deaths. We can now understand why there are famines in India. Their cause, in plain terms, is not the absence of sufficient food, but the inability of the people to pay for it. Famines have increased in frequency and severity under British rule. From 1770 to 1900, 25 million Hindus died of starvation. 15 million of these died in the last quarter of the century. In the famines of 1877, 1889, 1897, and 1900. Contemporary students estimate that 8 million will die of starvation in India during the present year. It was hoped that railways would solve the problem by enabling the rapid transport of food from unaffected to affected regions. The fact that the worst famines have come since the building of the railway proves that the cause has not been the lack of transportation nor the failure of monsoon rains, though this, of course, is the occasion, nor even overpopulation, which is contributory factor. Behind all these, as the fundamental source of the terrible famines in India, lies such merciless exploitation, such unbalanced exportation of goods, and such brutal collection of high taxes in the very midst of famine, that the starving peasants cannot pay what is asked for the food that the railway bring them. American charity has often paid for the relief of famines in India while the government was collecting taxes from the dying. There has never been a single year, says Dutt, when the food supply of the country was insufficient for the people. Let the late president of Union Theological Seminary, Dr. Charles C. Hall, speak. The obvious fact stares us in the fact that there is at no time, in no year, any shortage of foodstuffs in India. The trouble is that the taxes imposed by British government being 50% of the produce, the Indian starves that India's annual revenue may not be diminished by $1. 80% of the whole population has been thrown back upon the soil because England's discriminating duties have ruined practically every branch of native manufacture. We send shiploads of grain to India, but there is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. Famine is chronic there now. Though the same shipments of foodstuffs are made annually to England, the same drainage of millions of dollars goes on every year. The final item is death rate. In England, the death rate is 13 per thousand per year. In the United States, it is 12. In India, it is 32. Half the children born in Bengal die from reaching the age of 8. In a recent year, 1921, the infant mortality in Bombay was 666 per thousand. In one-room tenements, it was 828 per thousand. Lieutenant Colonel Dunn of the Indian Medical Services says that one half of the death rate is preventable. If we doubt this, we need only study of the case of Cuba, which under Spanish rule was ridden with malaria, typhus, and cholera, and had one of the world's highest death rates, while now, under freedom, it has become one of the healthiest of countries, and its death rate is among the lowest known. But in India, 10 are born, that 3 or 6 or 8 of them may die within a year. This is the conclusion of the play: taxation, exploitation, starvation, death. And now, having quoted authorities sufficiently to guard against relying on my own too brief experiences, I may be permitted, despite that limitation, to express my own judgmental and feeling. I came to India admiring the British, marveling at their imperial capacity for establishing order and peace, and thankful for the security which their policing of the world's waters has given to every traveler. I left India feeling that its awful poverty is an unanswerable indictment of its alien government, that so far from being an excuse for British rule, it is overwhelming evidence that the British ownership of India has been a calamity and a crime. For this is quite unlike the Mohammedans' domination. Those invaders came to stay, and their descendants call India their home. What they took in taxes and tribute they spent in India, developing its industries and resources, adorning its literature and art. If the British had done likewise, India would today be a flourishing nation. But the present plunder has now gone on beyond bearing. Year by year, it is destroying one of the greatest and gentlest peoples of history. The terrible thing is that this poverty is not a beginning, it is an end. It is not growing less, it is growing worse. England is not preparing India for self government. She is bleeding it to death. Even as we look on, said another loyal Englishman, H.M. Hindman, quote, unquote, India is becoming feebler and feebler. The very lifeblood of great multitude under our rule is slowly, yet ever faster, ebbing away. Any man who sees this crime and does not speak out is a coward. Any Englishman or any American seeing it and not revolted by it does not deserve his country or his name.